There are very small moments, yet they are enough to make a person lose themselves. You send a message. The screen lights up, then goes dark. No reply. At first, it is just waiting. Then it becomes guessing. Then you start wondering what you said wrong. You reread your words. You think about sending another message to clarify. You write, delete, write again. Finally, you send an explanation that no one asked for. That is the moment when everything starts to slip. Chasing does not begin with running after someone. It begins when you start doubting your own value because of someone else's silence. Begging does not always mean kneeling. It appears when you lower your boundaries to hold on to a connection that is already cracking. Explaining does not always mean making things clear. It is when you try to prove that you deserve to be treated with basic respect. That everyday moment repeats itself in many places. In love, at work, in social relationships. When you find yourself talking more than necessary, giving more than is fair, and staying longer than you should. Because inside you lives a very old fear, the fear of being abandoned. The human brain cannot tolerate ambiguity. Silence from others is interpreted as a threat. And to soothe that threat, you do the most familiar thing. You move forward. But here is the paradox. Every step you take forward from a place of insecurity, you move a little farther away from your own value. No one told you this earlier, that chasing does not create connection. It only exposes the emptiness inside you. In the next part, we will go deeper into why people chase to the point of hurting themselves. Not because they love too much, but because they fear loss more than they value themselves. People do not chase because they love deeply. They chase because they fear emptiness. When a relationship begins to shake, the first thing activated is not love, but the fear of abandonment. A very primitive feeling that if you are not important enough, you will be replaced. And from that fear, behavior begins to distort. You are not chasing the other person. You are chasing the feeling of safety. You do not beg because you are weak. You beg because you are trying to preserve a familiar version of your life. There is a truth that is very hard to accept. When you try to keep someone by lowering yourself, you are teaching them that your value is negotiable. You reply instantly. You adjust your opinions to please. You stay silent about things that hurt you. All of this is disguised under beautiful names: understanding, sacrifice, maturity. But underneath, the mechanism is very clear. You are trading boundaries to buy someone else's presence. And no transaction like that ends well. There was a man named Daniel who once believed that if he were patient enough, gentle enough, forgiving enough, the other person would stay. He explained everything. He apologized, even for things he did not do. He thought silence was the way to keep peace. But the more he did that, the more he was taken lightly. Not because he was not good enough, but because he was not standing firm. People respect boundaries, not unconditional self-sacrifice. When you are willing to lose yourself to keep someone else, you send a very dangerous signal that you need them more than they need you. In the next part, we will talk about a more subtle form of begging, one without words, without tears, but through excessive explanation, and why the more you explain, the more position you lose in every relationship. One of the most common forms of begging does not look desperate on the surface. It looks intelligent. It looks reasonable. It looks mature. It is excessive explanation. You explain your intentions. You explain your feelings. You explain why you acted the way you did. You explain again, hoping this time they will finally understand. But what you are really doing is trying to control how you are perceived. You believe that if you just explain clearly enough, people will treat you better. That misunderstanding is the reason for distance. That clarity will restore balance. Most of the time, this is not true. People rarely misunderstand your position. They simply do not prioritize it. When someone wants to understand you, you do not need many words. When someone does not, no amount of explanation will change that. The more you explain, the more you shift into a lower position. Because explanation implies that your boundaries require approval, that your feelings need permission to exist. There is a woman named Laura who found herself constantly explaining at work, explaining why she needed time, explaining why she could not take on more tasks, explaining why she felt overwhelmed. She thought she was being professional, but what she was actually doing was negotiating her own limits. And every time you negotiate your limits, people learn that those limits are flexible, optional, pushable. Silence, when used correctly, is not weakness, it is clarity. Not every action requires justification. Not every boundary requires a defense. Not every decision needs to be understood. The moment you stop explaining, something very uncomfortable happens. People who benefited from your explanations feel unsettled because they no longer have access to your inner reasoning. And that is exactly where your power returns. In the next part, we will talk about why chasing, begging, and explaining all come from the same root. A fear of being replaced, and how letting go of that fear changes not only how others treat you, but how you experience yourself. Chasing, begging, and explaining all come from the same place. The fear of being replaced. Not replaced by someone better, but replaced by someone easier. Someone who asks less. Someone who demands less. Someone who does not require effort. This fear lives very deep. It is not about romance alone. It appears in friendships, in families, in the workplace, anywhere your value feels uncertain. And once this fear is activated, you begin to perform. You perform patience, you perform understanding, you perform being low maintenance, all in the hope that if you make yourself easy enough to keep, you will not be abandoned. But here is the cruel truth. People do not value what costs them nothing. When you remove all friction, all boundaries, all resistance, you do not become more lovable. You become invisible. There is a man named Eric who stayed silent whenever he felt disrespected. He told himself that speaking up would push people away. So he endured. He adapted. He swallowed things that hurt him. People did not become closer. They became careless. Not because they were evil, but because Eric taught them how to treat him. This is the part most people do not want to hear. How others treat you is strongly influenced by what you tolerate. When you chase, you are saying, I am afraid to lose you. When you beg, you are saying, I need you more than you need me. When you explain, you are saying, my position is not firm unless you agree. All three sentences weaken your stance. Letting go of this fear does not mean becoming cold. It means becoming grounded. You stop trying to secure connection through self-sacrifice. You start allowing connection to exist only where there is mutual effort. This is terrifying at first, because it means accepting a painful possibility. Some people will leave when you stop chasing. Some will disappear when you stop explaining. Some will react negatively when you stop begging. But those departures are not losses, they are revelations. They reveal who was staying because you were bending, and who stays because they choose you. In the next part, we will talk about the most difficult step of all, learning to sit with silence. Not as punishment, but as a test of self-respect, and why silence is often the moment when power quietly returns to you. Silence is one of the hardest things to tolerate when you are afraid of losing someone. When you stop chasing, stop begging, stop explaining, silence appears. And in that silence, every old fear speaks. What if they forget me? What if they choose someone else? What if I made a mistake by pulling back? So you feel the urge to break the silence, to say something, anything, just to feel connected again. But silence is not emptiness. Silence is information. When you stop filling the space, you finally get to see what the other person does on their own. Do they reach out? Do they make effort? Do they meet you halfway? Or do they disappear? That answer is painful, but it is honest. There is a woman named Helen who decided to stop initiating contact with a friend who only showed up when it was convenient. The silence that followed lasted weeks. And during those weeks, Helen struggled deeply. She questioned herself constantly, but when the silence remained unbroken, she understood something clearly. She had not lost a connection. She had been carrying one alone. Silence exposes imbalance. It shows you whether the relationship was mutual or maintained only by your effort. This is why silence feels threatening, because it removes your ability to control the outcome. And control is what chasing is really about. When you chase, you are trying to manage uncertainty. When you beg, you are trying to prevent loss. When you explain, you are trying to influence perception. Silence does none of that. Silence requires you to trust yourself enough to accept whatever outcome appears. That trust is self-respect. When you can sit with silence without rushing to fix it, something powerful happens. You stop tying your worth to immediate responses. You stop measuring your value through attention. And slowly, your nervous system learns a new truth. I can survive without chasing. I can exist without being constantly chosen. This is the turning point. In the final part, we will bring everything together. What it truly means to never chase, never beg, never explain, not as rules of pride, but as principles of self-respect that quietly reshape your relationships and your inner world. Never chasing, never begging, never explaining is not about pride. It is about self-respect. Pride seeks to look strong. Self-respect seeks to stay whole. When you stop chasing, you accept this truth. Connection that requires you to run after it is not connection. It is pursuit driven by fear. When you stop begging, you accept another truth. Love, respect, and attention that must be pleaded for are already lost. When you stop explaining, you accept the deepest truth of all. You do not need to convince anyone of your worth. These principles are not weapons to control others. They are boundaries to protect yourself. You do not apply them to punish people. You apply them to stop abandoning yourself. A person who does not chase is not cold. They are secure enough to let things unfold. A person who does not beg is not arrogant. They simply know that mutual effort is the minimum requirement. A person who does not explain excessively is not distant. They trust that the right people do not need persuasion. This changes everything. Your relationships become fewer, but clearer. Your energy returns to you. Your self-respect becomes stable instead of conditional. Some people will call this ego. Others will feel uncomfortable. A few will respect you more. But none of that matters as much as one thing. You will no longer feel small in your own life. You will no longer lie awake wondering what you should have said. You will no longer replay conversations trying to fix perception. You will no longer betray your boundaries to avoid silence. You will stand where you are. You will speak when necessary. You will walk away when needed. And the most powerful change happens quietly. You stop asking to be chosen. You choose yourself. That is not arrogance. That is maturity.